What you see here is a simulation of how a virus would spread if you had an R number of 1.1, but also what would happen if we then reset it after, say, 500 cases. But the question is, what does this have to do with the future of journalism? Well, let's talk about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Baekdal. I'm a media analyst, in case you don't know me. And today we're going to talk about something that is very close to my heart. We're going to talk about the future of solution journalism, but also something that I call project journalism. These two things are representing one of the most important trends that we see in the media industry right now. And they are going to dominate any kind of news story where the public is directly involved. But let me explain what this really means. So first of all, let's go back to the old days, before all of this. So back in the days of print newspapers and print magazines, the way the public was reading news back then was to think about news as a mass market product. You knew that when you picked up the newspaper in your mailbox each morning, that this newspaper was not going to be specific to you as a person. You knew that it would be the same newspaper that you got, that your neighbors got, and everyone else in the city. Everyone got the same thing. So therefore, news was not about you. It was about news itself. And so the old way of thinking about news was that it is disconnected from you as a person. It's not about you. It's not made for you. It is made to give you a view of things around you. Now, this is also true for other factors, like, for instance, for magazines. Now, obviously, magazines are far more focused within a specific niche. So we have garden magazines, cooking magazines, in this case, a interior design magazine, or car magazines, whatever. But the concept is still the same. The magazine might have a slightly more specific focus that you are choosing to read, but the magazine is not written for you. Every story is about that topic, but it's not about the reader. Of course, we also see this with radio. I remember back when I was a teenager, a long time ago, but basically, if you wanted to listen to music, you just had to turn on to whatever radio channel that you preferred. In my case, it was the pop channel, obviously. And then you just had to hope. You had to hope that the DJ or the radio host was going to play the songs that you liked, but you had no control because you knew that they were not actually making a radio program for you. And of course, we saw the same thing for TV and other things. But then the internet came along. And think about what's happening on the internet today. If I go to Spotify, then I'm not going to just get a radio channel where someone else is picking random music for a mass market. Instead, what we are getting is your channel. So in this case, you see a screenshot from my Spotify channel. And as you can see, it says, here are my top shows. In this case, my top podcast. And here are my playlists. And these playlists are specifically made for me. So the playlist that Spotify is making for me is going to be different from the playlist it's going to make for you. And just think about this mindset. This is completely different from everything we've looked at. And it impacts every part of society and every part of media, because suddenly media is being perceived by the public as something that is supposed to be made for them. And so we see it with radio, we see it with TV, which has now become streaming, where you pick what you want to watch each evening. We see it with magazines, where fitness magazines, for instance, has to be about what you want to get better about yourself. But in the newspaper industry, we are still not seeing it a lot. Or rather, we are seeing it, but many people in the news industry are still thinking this doesn't apply to them. Because the news industry is still thinking that news is just news. And it's not supposed to be about specific people. But it is, actually. And the same trend is now happening to news. So this is where solution journalism comes in, because we have to now think about this in a different way. I want to give you a couple of examples before we start talking about COVID. I showed the example of COVID when we started, but I want to just give you an idea about what solution journalism really is and why our traditional journalism is such a big problem. To illustrate this story, I want to take you back to 2016. This is actually something I've written about before. I've written a whole article about how something like this is impacting local news. But back in 2016, there was a very big forest fire in an area north of Edmonton in Canada called Fort McMurray. And when I say it was big, I mean it was really big. This forest fire burned down 590,000 hectares of land. It burned down 2,400 houses. Another 2,000 houses were declared unsafe. They weren't exactly burned down, but they were also not safe to get back to. And as you can see here, 88,000 people had to be evacuated. It was said to be the most expensive forest fire in the history of Canada. Now, I personally had an interest in this fire. If you don't know this, I live in Europe, but as it happens, my sister lives north of Edmonton in Canada. And so when I started hearing about this, I obviously wanted to know about it because I wanted to make sure that my sister was safe. It turns out that Canada is a really, really big place. And even though my sister lives north of Canada, Fort McMurray is 300 kilometers further north of Canada. So my sister was safe, right? Thankfully. But it was still, to me, it was still a very important story. Now, let me show you the problem we then saw with the media. Now, when you think about traditional media, what is it that a traditional journalist do? Well, a traditional journalist is a reporter. They go to somewhere, they look at what's happening, and then they go back to the newspaper, they write an article, and they says, hey, this is what's happening. So here's an example from Fort McMurray today. This is a local newspaper from Fort McMurray. And as you can see, you have here a normal news report, right? They're telling you this thing happened, people are being evacuated, and so forth. In the same article, they also wrote this about the people who were specifically evacuated, that people were honking their horns, they were having all these kind of trouble and all these kinds of things. This is traditional journalism. You tell people what is happening. But here's a problem. Ask yourself this. Who are they actually writing this for? I mean, the people who are living in Fort McMurray, who are now being evacuated, they are the ones who are stuck in traffic, who are honking their horns, who are trying to get out, who are trying to do other things. So this newspaper is telling their own readers what their readers are doing. That doesn't make any sense. Why are you telling people what they already know? They are the ones doing it. Why are you telling them what they're doing? This is weird. But this is the problem with local, traditional local news. So what we also saw was another problem. So this newspaper obviously has a Facebook page, like every newspaper has. And on the Facebook page, it did the same thing. It would go to the press conferences from the authorities, and they would get the latest information about where things were happening. And then, as you can see here, they would put that information up on Facebook. And from a traditional journalist perspective, this sounds like a very useful thing, because the newspaper is saying, oh, this is what the authorities are saying. Here is the information, right? They're reporting. But look at what's happening here underneath it, right? Underneath this are some of the readers asking specific questions. They're asking, well, is this area okay? Is this area safe? What about this road? What about this place? But the problem is that as a traditional newspaper, as a traditional journalist, the Fort McMurray today never considered interacting with the readers as part of their job. So they were just reporting what they were seeing. But they didn't think about news as something that was interactive, as something that was part of a community. So the local newspaper never replied to this. Ever. And think about this. Here we have readers asking, thank you for giving me this mass market generalized information. But I don't need mass market general information. What I want is specific information that is related to me as an individual. How does this apply to me? and the newspaper didn't answer. Now, as it happens, there was also another group in this area called the RMWB, that is the local municipality. And from this group, there were 2 employees that mostly on their own accord decided to give people information as well. And so on their Twitter page, as you see here, they started bringing people the same information. So this is the same thing as the local newspaper is doing, right? They're not anything different. It's the same concept. But of course, people started asking them questions as well. And because they weren't thinking about this as journalism, they were thinking about this as community, they started responding. And so what you see here is a person asking, any news on Gregory hearing mixed things? And they're asking, that residential area is untouched. Another person saying, we're hearing rumors that Anzac may be evacuated, and say, okay, no, that's not actually the case. And then we're seeing, what about this thing we're seeing? What is that? And say, well, that's actually just a sunset, right? So what these groups are saying is, what they're doing is they are directly interacting and communicating with their audience, because they realize that they are not just there to provide information. They are there to help support the public, to be a part of the community. And they continue to do this, throughout this fire. It was an amazing job that they did, right? So here a person saying, any word on the damage in this case? 12 houses gone, really bad. But underneath that, you see this person saying that they've been evacuated and they're displaced and they're starting to panic. Well, what is happening here? We don't know what to do. And they go in and say, well, the wind is actually blowing in the other direction, so you're safe, right? Just you think there's no problem here. We know that you're there. We are fully aware of the situation. Don't worry, you're safe. Think about this. Now, what I want you to notice here as well is notice the like buttons. I know the number is not that big. We have 17 there and we have 7 underneath. But what people are doing here, of course, is they're not liking that houses are burned down. What they're doing here is they're saying, thank you. Thank you for helping us answer our questions. Thank you for being part of our community. Thank you for doing this great job of keeping our information and keeping us informed. This is really, really useful to what we're going to do. And so this is the key, right? But think about it again. The local newspaper, it didn't do any of this. It never interacted with this. So people started seeing the local newspaper as just something that was disconnected. It was talking about other people. It wasn't talking about them. Now, this is not unique to just the Fort Boyer today. When I was analyzing this, again, I was very interested in this because I thought maybe my sister wasn't in harm's way. She wasn't. But here's another local newspaper from back then. This is the Edmonton Journal. Now, we can debate whether they're actually a local newspaper or not. I mean, Canada's big. It's difficult. But they have filed this under local news. And they're doing the same thing. Now, mind you, this article is actually pretty good. They are covering a lot of different things. They're making very clear about what is going on. And they're telling you, it's just jam-packed with information. But the problem, again, is all the information is being provided to people who are somehow not part of it, because it's telling people about things that are in a way that is not directed to people that's there. So here's an example of this, right? It tells people, this is from that article, it tells people that travel is tough, and officials says there's no more gasoline in all these areas. Well, crap. But who are they writing this for, right? I mean, the people who are actually doing the traveling, the 88,000 people who are being evacuated, they know it's tough. They're the ones out there. They're the ones driving. They're the ones running out of gas. So a news article like this doesn't help them. You're not actually writing this news for the local community. You're writing this news for people who are not there. It's very weird. Here's another example. This is again from the same article. So it says the traffic was diverted from, this road, and in other parts the traffic was restricted. So as a media analyst, I looked at this and I noticed these words here, right? It was diverted. It was restricted. What does that mean? Does it mean that it's no longer diverted? Does that mean that the roads are open again? What is happening here? What does that mean? More to the point, what are people going to do with this? What is the point of this? How can this doesn't seem to help us. Now, I want to give you another example of this. So we're going to move away from Canada and instead move to Texas. Now, as you probably remember, back in February this year, there was a very big snowstorm or blizzard, and it had a serious consequence for a lot of people in Texas. So here's a news story. Again, this is traditional news story, and it is telling people what is happening. So it's telling, well, there are 4 million people who have lost power. Well, crap. And then it just goes on to just report the news like any other newspaper is doing. But here's the question. Again, who are you writing this for? It's certainly not people in Texas. Because imagine if you are living in Texas, right? You open up the news and it tells you, well, there's a blizzard. Well, thank you. I can see that. It's out. When I look out the window, there's snow everywhere. You don't have to tell me it's a blizzard. I know there's a blizzard. Oh, and there are people who don't have power. Oh, so that's why I don't have any power in my house, is because there's no power. Right? This form of news has no value. But in the traditional media world, we think this is what journalism is about. But as soon as a story is actually directly impacting the public, this form of news is mostly useless because you're telling people something that they already know, and you're basically only creating news for people who are not there. It's not a good form of news. Now, how do we fix this? Well, let me give you an example of this. Here we have the Texas Tribune. And I love the Texas Tribune. The Texas Tribune is one of the best newspapers I know. They've done so many good things over the years. I just admire them. So what they've done is they realized that, wait a minute, 4 million of our readers don't have any power. They're stuck at home in a blizzard. They have all kinds of troubles. And of course, when they don't have power, well, they don't have heat. They don't have computers because computers need power. They're home rulers, meaning their internet, that's out. So what should we do as a newspaper to help our readers? So what the Texas Tribune did was they set up a text messaging service. And the text messaging service allowed people to text them, and that will give them practical, useful information about what people needed to know. And as you can see, as they're writing here also, you can also ask them questions. So the Texas Tribune became a hub for people who needed help. This is brilliant. This is freaking awesome. Every newspaper should do this. But think about the difference here, right? What you see here is traditional journalism, and it has almost no value. But what you see here with the Texas Tribune is solution-based journalism. And solution-based journalism is exactly what people need when the public itself is in trouble. That's why this is so important, and that's why this trend is defining this in such a big way. And this is just two very simple examples of this. Now, let's talk about project journalism. So project journalism is a kind of a subset of solution-based journalism. But what's different about project journalism is that it's based on achieving a certain type of thing. Now, it could be many different things, but if we have a problem in society where we need to get a solution and where it's the public itself who are part of actually creating that solution, then our job as the press is not just to report what is happening, because as you can see before, that is not helpful. Our job is now to think about our reporting in relation to that project. How can we use the power of journalism, the power of the press, to help achieve the goal so that the public no longer has this specific problem? Now, obviously, there's a lot of different examples of this, but the most important example we have right at this very moment is COVID. COVID is one of those things where project journalism is the most critical thing that we can do in order to get things right. Because with COVID, we have two elements that we need to get right in order to get through this. The first thing, of course, is the government. The government has a number of responsibilities in order to help us stop this pandemic and help, fix all these problems. One of the first things it must do is that the government must provide data and bias information, because they're the ones who have it. They're the ones who are in contact with the CDC and other, government organization, whatever it is in your country, and they're the ones doing the calculations and doing the things in order to see where the data is heading. And government's actually doing a pretty good job at this. I mean, we have very good data for the COVID pandemic, much better data than we've ever had for anything else before. So that's good. The other thing it must do is it must facilitate test and tracing. It must facilitate test and tracing, because that's not something we can do on our own. That's an infrastructure problem. And so the government must provide that. Another thing it must provide is it must manage our healthcare system. So make sure that the hospitals are properly stocked and functional and everything is running efficiently and it's not overrun and we don't run out of resources. Again, that's a government problem. And then, of course, very importantly, the government must do the things that is necessary to provide a vaccine. Again, as a citizen, I can't buy a vaccine. I can't make vaccines happen. That's a government thing. And then finally, if things start to go really, really badly, if things start to go really wrong, then the government also have a final task, and that is they must impose restrictions for the sake of public good in order to get things back under control. So for instance, if the hospital starts to be overrun, the government needs to step in. If things are happening in a way, the government needs to act. Now, what's important about this is nobody wants to do this. You don't want restrictions. I don't want restrictions. The opposition parties certainly don't want restrictions for all kinds of political reasons. Nobody wants restrictions. So this is the last step, and it's only used when things are really bad. Now, from a journalistic perspective, of course, our job in this is to hold the government to account. We must make sure that these things are happening in the right order and in the right way and in efficient and productive form. And, well, we're actually pretty good at that, right? This is something that journalists are very good at. So when countries were not having enough vaccines or when the hospitals didn't have enough resources or equipment, we stepped in as the press and demanded answer, demanded action, demanded things. We held those in power to account so that we got the best result. And we've actually been doing a fairly good job of this. But this is only half the story, because the other half of the story is what the public must do. One of the most important things about this pandemic is it's not a government problem. It's a societal problem. And it's not the government who is spreading the virus, it's the public who is spreading the virus. And so while the government has a lot of responsibility providing the infrastructure and all these different things, the government can't actually stop it. The government is not in position to really stop the virus. That is on us as the public. We are the ones who must stop spreading it. We are the ones who must take action. And so the public must do things to minimize the spread. Even if the government isn't telling us specifically to do so, even if they're not ordering us with laws, it's still the role of the public to help minimize the spread. The second thing is that things like wear a mask or washing our hands, although that part, the hand washing thing, less important than it used to be. Anyway, and we must also encourage the public to get vaccinated. I mean, it's the government's job to provide the vaccine, but it's the public's job to get the vaccine, right? Very, very important. And of course, if we think about this from a press perspective, well, our role here as the press is to help provide the information and the focus and all these different things so that the public understands the importance of this. And we must do this in a consistent, clear, fact-based way so that the public has a very good direction and understanding about what needs to be done. The worst thing we can do is to confuse the public. If we confuse the public, we make it impossible to do any of these things. Here, however, and I hate saying this, I really hate saying this, but here is where we started to see one of the biggest problems I've seen. Now, remember, I'm a media analyst. I analyze the media. But what I've seen in the media over the past year and a half is that we've been very good at holding the government to account. But when it came to the public, we have made so many mistakes. So here are a number of headlines, for instance, right? Here are a number of headlines. And as you can see, these headlines, they're talking about vaccines. And they're saying, oh, look at all these people who are vaccinated who then got sick. And oh, look, two full vaccines didn't stop these people in this city of Viborg, that's a city in Denmark, didn't stop them from getting the virus. Oh my God. Really? Newspapers? What the fuck are you doing? What is happening here is that we are still focusing on news from a traditional journalism perspective. And in traditional journalism, whenever something happens, we report it. We don't think about what that information means. We just think about it as, here's some information, we must now report it. And that's what they're doing. They're reporting the news. And technically, this is true. Technically, 10% of people did get the virus, but of course, and yes, these people in Viborg, they also got the virus. Technically, these stories are true, but they are also massively misleading because the vaccines actually work. So these stories create a perception in people's mind that is not true. Most of all, though, what it also does is that it creates anti-vaccine sentiment. Because when people go to the news, they read stories like this, they start to think, oh my God, the vaccine is dangerous. Oh my God, it doesn't work. I just don't want to be vaccinated. People start saying that. And then suddenly we have all the problems we have. So this is bad. And it's bad because here we are talking directly to the public and we're basically failing at our journalistic duty. Now here's another example. This is actually one thing that I find even worse. One thing I've noticed in the press is that we've been very, very bad at talking about the R number. Now, as a journalist editor, you already know what this is, but let me just repeat it. The R number illustrates how the pandemic is going. So if the pandemic has an R number above 1, it means that a pandemic is accelerating. More and more people are getting infected. If the R number is below 1, it means that less and less people are getting infected. And if the R number is 1, it means that whatever rate it was before, it is now at that same rate. And so here we see how this is being reported in the news. So here we have news saying, oh, wait a minute, the R number has dropped to 1. That means that it's now stable. No, that's not what it means. And then you can see the article afterwards, right? Because it's 1, because it's stable, because there's no longer anything to worry about, we've interviewed some experts and they're saying, oh, now it's no longer dangerous. Let's drop the restrictions. There's nothing to worry about here. We don't need restrictions anymore because we have R1. I'll get back to this in just a second. Here's another article. This one is even worse. This article says the R number had dropped to 1.1. And many journalists think that R1.1 is fine. That you can just do 1.1 just as much as 1 because it sounds like it's so close, right? R1, 1.1 is just 0.1 different. What does that matter? What does that matter? And as you can see, we should go down in the actual article. I mean, obviously the article is much longer than this, but going down the article, they have a quote from a professor who says that there's nothing to worry about. We don't have to worry about this. This is fine. R1.1, fine. It's probably even lower. Fine. It's dropped. But also notice the wording here. It's dropped. It's no longer important. This gives the perception in people's minds that R1 or anything close to it is acceptable. But it also gives the perception that it's slow. So if it's R1, in people's minds, when people read things like this, they start thinking that R1 means that things are no longer really a problem. Okay? Now, I want to illustrate something to you. Because everything you just seen here is wrong. it is complete misunderstanding about how R numbers work. And so let me switch over to something. Switch over to this. What you see now here behind me is a simulation. It's not specific to COVID, but it's simulation about how R numbers impact things when we do different things. Now, as you can see up on the top, we have some numbers. I have the R number over here. We have number of new cases. We have active cases, total cases, number of people who died. Then I have some buttons I can click on. We'll get to those. And then I have some numbers over here. We'll also get to those. Now, let's just do a very, very simple experiment. I'm going to go into here. We have the R1. I'm just going to start a virus, right? So we're going to infect someone. And with R1, let's see what happens. So what you see now is at R1, because we have just started very low, we have one new case per day, right? That's one new case per day. And it just spreads very, very slowly. Now, what you can see now over here is we're starting to see something different. And what's different is that people get infected, but then they get well again. Most people get well, but you see two extra colors. The blue color is indication of those who get long COVID. Long COVID is something we've not been very good at covering it in the press, but long COVID is when people get the virus, they get sick, but then they recover, but they have lingering effects. These can be that their lungs was actually damaged, so they still experience shortness of breath. That's no fun. They might have headaches every day. They might have other problems. You don't want to have long COVID. And long COVID can last for a long time afterwards. The virus itself only takes a week or two, but long COVID can take months. What we know, though, this is a good thing, is that long COVID usually solves itself. I mean, some people might need some extra training, but it's not permanent, which is good. Now, the other number of things you can see here now is that there's also a number of red dots. The red dots are people who died. Now, here's the thing, though. When you look at this, you can see that it's just moving very, very slowly, right? It's just, there's not really much happening here. And imagine then that you are over here, right? You are somewhere here, and it's R1, and things are spreading very slowly. Things are not really happening. And so you think, oh, I'm fine. Who cares? It's stable. Nothing to worry about, right? Well, first problem with R1 is it doesn't stop. Yes, it's happening very slowly right now, but it doesn't stop. Eventually, you will get COVID. And it doesn't matter whether you've been vaccinated or not. Sure, being vaccinated works, and it gives you, and you're much less likely to actually be infected. But if it stays at R1, you will still end up getting it. You'll probably not die from it. You'll hopefully not get long COVID, but you'll still get it. That's what R1 means. R1 means everyone gets it. It's like opera. You get it, that person did it, everyone gets it. Right? We don't want R1. Now, let me reset this. I'm going to show you something now. I'm going to go over here again, right? I'm going to change this number to 1.1. And I'm going to ask you this very simple question. What do you think is going to happen now? Well, remember the news article I just showed you earlier that was saying, oh, this is no problem. And this is a perception that I've seen, not just in the press, but in a lot of people, that R1.1 doesn't sound like much. I mean, it's 10%. So if it's going that slowly before, then 10% is just means that it will go 10% faster. And that's still pretty slow. So who cares? Well, let's try it, right? We are going to start the pandemic again. And then, what? What? What the? How? What just happened? Well, this is the problem with R1.1. The R number is not just 10%. It's an exponential number. So it keeps adding 10%. And it keeps adding. And it keeps on adding. So it keeps adding more and more. And so the problem is, as you can see here, is that yes, it starts out slow, but suddenly it starts to pick up speed and we get an exponential rate. Let me just run it again, right? This is R1.1 and it just goes soup. And we have this gigantic problem. So every single time you see a newspaper go out and say, oh, R1.1 is not a problem, it's dropped to R1.1, it's fine, nothing to worry about, run away. That newspaper is lying to you. Of course, they don't intend to lie. They actually think they're doing good journalism. But I see so many articles that is defined this way. And as a media analyst, I'm just frustrated because it illustrates that in the media industry, we have managed to mislead ourselves about what the R numbers are. Now, I'm going to do another experiment here. We're going to set the first number again to R1.1. But then, as I said before, I had these two extra numbers over here. These two extra numbers gives me the ability to change what is happening after a certain period of time. So let's say, for instance, that I want that after 500 cases, we are going to reset the R number to 1. So we're going to start off over here with R1.1. And then once we have 500 cases, we set it back to 1. Now remember what I showed you before. R1 before, when we just tried that, was really, really slow. So what do you think happens now? Right? We start with 1.1, then we go to 1. Well, let's run the simulation once again. So again, it starts up, because of 1.1, it accelerates, reach 500 cases, and what? But why? Well, the problem is, again, R1 does not mean that things are slow. It does not mean that things are stable. It does not mean that things are under control. The only thing that R1 means is that at whatever point we were, when it got to R1, it continued at that level. So if I run this simulation again, right, we start off with R1.1, it goes up, and then here it reaches 500 cases, but it doesn't stop because there are 50 new cases per day and it just continues to go. This is R1 when we have a higher baseline. So never, ever tell people in the press that R1 is stable. Do not ever report that to people. Do not ever make people believe that R1 means that things are fine, that things are under control, because that is not what that number means. It has never been what that number means. Now, I want to show you one more thing. Actually, I want to show you two more things. We're going to reset this again. We're going to start off with R1.1 once again. We're going to set it to 500. But now we're going to change this number to, let's try 95. Just as an example, right? What this means is we will start off again with a pandemic. It starts to spread. It will reach 500 and then it will go to 95, R95. What that means is that if we had 100 new cases yesterday, then tomorrow there will only be 95. 5 people. That's the difference here. So let's try to run this, right? We are going to run this. It's going to speed up again until we reach 500 cases. And then you can see we have 0 new cases. We've stopped the pandemic. It's over. We're free. Yay! This is amazing. Right? Think about what's happening here. Right? Just think about what's happening here. The only thing we changed was that we put the R number below 1, and not by much, not by some big amount. We just put it below to 0.5. So think about this as a newspaper. Think about this as a journalist. If you can use your journalism to impact just 5% of your readers, we stop the virus. We can stop this. We can end this. And so right now, I see a lot of people, both in the press, I've even seen editors-in-chiefs going on and said, oh, we can't just stop the virus. We just have to live with. This is going on forever. There's nothing we can do, blah, blah, blah. That is not true. We can very, very easily stop this pandemic. All it takes is that if we as journalists focus our reporting on getting R below 1. It doesn't have to be much. In fact, let me show you something. I'm going to reset this again. We're going to set R 1.1. We're going to set this to 500. And then we're going to set this to 0.97. Right? So now we're talking about only 3 people out of 100. What's going to happen? Well, again, it starts spreading. Now, because we have even less people, obviously it's going to spread a bit more. But just because it's 97, it's still going to stop. So now we have 2 cases, and now we are, soon here. We are back to 1. 0. Now we have 0 cases, the pandemic is over. Now, obviously, this is a bit stupid because we already, it didn't really save anyone. So we should do more than this. But the point is, every single time someone tells you that we can't stop the pandemic, that is a lie. They're not saying that because we can't stop it. They're saying that because they don't know how to stop it. And when I see this happening in the press, it's happening because the press has somehow convinced itself that R1 is stable. R1 is not stable. R 0.97 is stable. This is the most fundamental thing that you must understand as a journalist. Now, here's the thing. Let me just reset this again. Obviously, we're going to start, we have 500 cases before. But imagine instead, we have 100 cases. I'm going to take this exactly the same numbers before, 97. Now we have 100 cases. What is going to happen now? Well, it's going to spread. And then once we reach 100 cases, it's going to stop. Well, it's not stopping immediately. As you can actually see, we get up to here. Okay, come on. Last person there. So now we have 0 new cases. We actually ended up reaching 448 people ended up getting the virus, even though we stopped it after 100. So it doesn't stop immediately. But look at the difference. Look at this. If we could get the numbers lower before we start to do things that somehow undermines it, then the virus will be so much more easier to control. And this is what want to tell you here, because this is what project journalism is. Project journalism is about figuring out what is the most efficient way that we can stop the pandemic, and how can we use our journalism to do that. And as you can see here, there are really only 2 factors. The first factor is the R number. We should focus our journalism on getting the R number below 1, because if we do that consistently, this pandemic is over. We don't have to have another year of a pandemic. It's over, right? In a month, maybe 2, it's gone everywhere. People say, oh, no, it's not happening. But again, this is the role of the press. Right? I know the public is going to fight us in every kind of way, but it's the role of the press to make that happen. The other thing is this number that you see up here is the baseline. The lower we can get the baseline, the more we can control it. This, for instance, is what they're doing in New Zealand. You might have heard recently that they introduced a very short-term lockdown after they only found 1 cases. Now, probably there's just not 1 case. There's probably something more like 10, right? Because they just don't know about the other people. But let's see what that happens. If we start again with 1.1 and we spread it, there are 10 people, right? They go up to... Okay, let's try that again. 1.1, and 10 people. So what I forgot to do here, 10 people, and then 0.97. What I forgot to do here is add the latest number. But let me show you here, right? So we run this, right? And what happens is that very, very quickly the pandemic is stopped. And this is what happened in New Zealand. New Zealand has been mostly free. And you could say, oh, but New Zealand is an island in the middle of nowhere. They can control it much better than others. And yes, that's true, but it doesn't change the math and it doesn't change the concept. If we collectively, newspapers in the Western world, focused our mindset around this, then we can stop it too. There is nothing that indicates that we can't stop COVID. That's why this is product journalism. Now, one of the problems I have every single time I talk about something like this, and let me just switch back to the other thing here, is that whenever I start to talk about doing these things, people are saying to me, but we can't live with the restrictions forever, right? That's the go-to thing that people tell me. We can't, but we don't have to. I want to illustrate why. What you see here is a graph from Denmark. This is the country I live in. Obviously, yeah, I chose this graph because that's why I live. But it's not actually specific to Denmark. And what you see here is what is happening over the past year. And what you saw is that here, right, we have the second wave. And you can see how that has formed. Underneath this is we have another graph, and this graph is the R number. And I created this red line here that illustrates where R1 is. So notice what is happening here, right? We start off before the second wave, and the R number is it's above 1. And when it's above 1, we get an exponentially accelerating growth. And you can see that, right? That's what this is. This graph is an exponential growth, and it's happening because the R number is consistently, mostly, above 1. When that happens, we get this. What you then also see is that in Denmark, we introduced lockdowns, and you can see exactly where that happens. You can see it down here. Lockdown happened right down here, and then look at the graph above, right? Suddenly, the graph goes down again. And it isn't just going down gradually. No, it's going down at an exponential rate. Why? Because that's what the R number is doing. R number is exponential. It's both exponential where things are growing, but it's also exponential where things are dropping. And we got back to this point, right? We actually got down to 0.7, which was amazing. So what happened in Denmark was that both the opposing political parties, right, the right-wing parties, and the press, they started saying, oh, we don't want lockdown. So here in Denmark, there was actually newspaper articles from the editors-in-chief of some of the largest newspapers in Denmark calling on the government to end restrictions because we were now below R1, and therefore we didn't have to do anything. And so what you see here is, at this point, they forced the government to end restrictions. And you can see this, right? Look at what's happening down here, right? Look at this data down here. You can see exactly when that happened. We stopped having restrictions because that was what the newspapers and opposing political parties wanted us to do. Then the R number got above 1. We brought the virus back. And then you can see how that has resulted in the rest of the year. Now, people say that we had to do this because we couldn't have restrictions for a long time. But let me show you something. I'm going to draw a line now. This line illustrates what would have happened if we had kept the focus of the restriction just for a little bit longer. So look at this line, right? It goes down to here, right? That is 1 week. If we had kept our focus for just 1 more week, we would have brought the virus numbers down to almost 0. I don't really think we could have reached 0, but we would have brought it down to a level where suddenly we could manage much better. And if you remember the simulation I just saw you, lower starting point numbers means that we can control things so much better. But instead, here in Denmark, we chose to open up again a week too soon. 1 week. And this was because the press has convinced themselves that the R1 number was a tolerable thing where things were stable. It's not. We should never have done this. We could have all of this be over with. It's insane. 1 week is the difference here. We only needed lockdown for 1 more week. And then we would have numbers down to the level that they had in New Zealand. And then we could just manage it on a case-to-case basis with a very effective test and tracing and the vaccines and whatever. And suddenly we would be in a much better place. But instead, what we have now is we've had, during the entire summer, we've had 1,000 daily cases. And 1,000 daily cases is something like 30,000. Because remember, 30,000 cases in the US. Because remember, Denmark is a very small country. So this is insane. And now we're heading into winter. And we know that when winter arrives, it's going to go up again. So we're starting off with 1,000 daily infected before we know it's going to go up again. When we could have gone down to almost 0. And then we have been in a much better place. 1 week. I just want you to think about this. Right? If you're a journalist, or editor, think about this. This is why COVID as a project is such an important way to think about journalism. It's not something you can just report about. You cannot just react to what people are saying or what, these politicians are saying something, let's report that. No, you have to think about it as a project, and you have to find the most efficient way to get something done. What we did in Denmark was that we found the least efficient way, and that has caused us to continue to have a problem. Now, here's the thing. Everyone knows this. You know this. I know this. But for some reason, we just start thinking about it when it comes to COVID. But here's the thing I want you to think about. Imagine that your house is on fire. What do? Well, it's obvious. You run over to your phone. You pick up your phone. You dial 911. Because the faster you can run, and the faster you can call the fire department, the quicker they will arrive, and the less fire do they have to deal with. In other words, the lower the baseline is. That's why you call the fire department immediately. You don't just say, well, let's wait until 3 of the rooms are completely engulfed in flames and then call the fire department. Because that would be stupid. I mean, so you call them immediately. What you also don't do is, at some point when the fire department arrives, they start to put out the fire and they start to get things under control. So what do? Well, what you're not doing is you don't say, oh, thank you, firefighters, for getting things under control. You can go home now, right? The fire is now under control. We don't need you anymore. Go home. You will never do that because that would be stupid. Why would you tell the firefighters to go home when they have things under control? When they have things under control does not mean that things has to stop. That means that now you have to keep going until the fire is out. And so in the real world, what you're actually doing is you're saying, thank you, firefighters, for getting fire under control so it isn't burning down my whole house. But please put out the rest of the fire now. Let's get this done. You know this, right? You do this if there's a fire in your house. So why are you not doing this with COVID? I don't understand this. As a media analyst, I really don't understand this. Now, here's the thing. COVID is just one example. It's a very important example right now. But the concept and the trends around solution journalism and project journalism, of course, is not limited to just COVID. It is also about every other story where the public is directly involved. The most important story that we have about this over the next decade is going to be climate change. Climate change is a story similar to COVID. It's a story that is directly affecting your readers. It's a story where both the government has to do something, but the public also has to act. And it's a story that, because of these two things, cannot be approached with traditional journalism. So you have to cover climate change the same way as you would cover like the forest fire in Canada or the blizzard in Texas or COVID. It's a story that requires a solution. And for some parts of that solution, there is a specific project where the role of the press is to help achieve that goal. Help us achieve climate change, or rather to fix the problem with climate change more correctly. And so this is why solution-based journalism and that whole trend is so important. Now, I hope this was interesting. I was actually thinking about just writing an article about all this, but I was thinking, let's try this as a video instead. So I hope you like this format, and I would really like to know, what you thought about this. Should I do more videos? Should I do more explanatory journalism kind of stories like this? But let me know. Also, of course, I've written so many other articles about this. I wrote a whole article about the thing that happened in Canada in much more detail. I've written a lot of articles about both solution journalism and relevance in ORCAD. And all that, of course, is part of Baekdal Plus. That's what I do. I've added some links below if you want to find specific articles, but otherwise, check out Baekdal Plus. That's it's how things work, and it's how I make a living, and it really helps. So thank you for your time, and as they say when you make video, please like, subscribe, and all those other stuff.